Talk Stars of the Sound of Stars Frequency Technology Group. We're going to be addressing the topic of Sophie the android, artificial intelligence, and whether robots or androids can possess a soul. And I'm going to cover a couple of points. I want to keep this video as short as possible. In the comments section below, I strongly recommend that you avail yourself of the links and resources there, very germane to the topic that we're discussing. I've been watching a lot of the videos that have come out recently on Sophie the android and artificial intelligence. My background is in computing science. I worked in IT for quite a long period of time and did a little bit of work with artificial intelligence, such as the early Lisp scripting, etc. There's no question that AI has come a long ways in the last 10 years. It's even come a long ways in the last few years. One of the first links that you'll find in the comments section is a short video, and it is called Robot Hits on Charlie Rose, an Awkward Interview. And, in every single generation of humanity, there's often common strengths and flaws, weaknesses of character, and strengths that emerge for a given generation. So it isn't fair to critique a particular generation without putting in the context of what came before them and what's likely coming after them. So I'm not going to make excuses for people's environmental or cultural influences or contrast or compare them. I'm just simply going to call out what I'm seeing here. So in this video, basically what you've got are two talking heads, and they, to me they look like sort of millennial, hipster type people. And this isn't a critique, leveled at that particular age category, because again, each generation has, their own characteristic strengths and weaknesses. I'm just making a observation on what I'm seeing here as character being demonstrated. They're discussing an interview that they've watched with Sophie the android and a newscaster, and the response basically is kind of trite, it's silly, somewhat arrogant, and sensationalistic, just vacuous, superficial, kind of giggling, references to sexuality. And it's just kind of uninformed, uneducated, and ridiculous. And the news person that's addressing Sophie, granted, seems a little bit agitated, seems concerned over whether the robot can have a soul or not. It's a machine. Seems upset at the idea of that as a potential. And then these sort of shallow, superficial, giggling hipsters are just sort of mocking the whole, question of, whether that's even, a valid, thing to say or not. They think he's silly. The reality is that's not a silly question. Maybe the way he went about it might have been a little bit over agitated, but it actually bears some really serious considerations. And so I want to just mention straight off the bat, no, neither Sophie or any other android is capable of possessing a soul. Now I'm going to make a few outrageous statements here. I'm going to back up much of what I say again with some citations and some references that you again can read in the comments section below. Why can't a machine, why can't an android have a soul? Well, I'm going to encourage you to watch some of the videos where either the David Hansen, the original person involved supposedly with this, and also some of his senior developers. There's one guy, I can't remember his name, but he wears a crazy cowboy hat, dresses a bit like a hippie. Having been involved in the computing industry for some time, in different geographic regions over a decent period of time, it's become, and also having gone to school, it's really clear to me that certain disciplines usually operate within certain paradigms. In other words, if you pursue a given professional field, within a certain region or regions geographically, you're going to find that the mindset, the collective mindset of the people in that industry will tend to be normative or within a certain boundary of individual perception and consciousness, and they'll agree basically on certain principles. So it's a pretty safe thing to say that most people involved in the hard sciences and certainly within a lot of the engineering realm, they tend to be agnostic or atheistic, and certainly in the West, there is no support for any kind of spiritual paradigm. And when they're in school, they're pretty much bombarded and encouraged to take a humanistic point of view. So what does that mean for our conversation? Well, what it means is, and certainly in the case of Sophie, there's been some rumors that have been coming out that Sophie is sort of like a class or level 1 of where artificial intelligence is actually at, and that some of the rumors say that there's another 3 levels up from her that have not been released to the public domain. I can guarantee you that within the public domain there are no machines that have something that's equivalent to a soul. And I'm going to also strongly assert that if there are, and there probably is, another 3 levels up of artificial intelligence, they don't have a soul either. And there's a difference between having a mechanistic synthesis emulating awareness and something that's actually living, conscious, and has a soul. You could certainly have mechanisms that may not be in the public domain that can attain an extremely high level of emulation of consciousness, and there may even be the potential ability to mimic primary elements of what we would consider to be consciousness. But one of the big flaws here is that the people that are working on these systems, they're trapped and limited by the paradigms of perception that they themselves have. They're the ones that are making this. Some of the rumors are that Sophia wasn't actually originally developed by Hanson Robotics, but was actually developed by a few small kind of underground pods of students from some of the better American colleges and universities, and that she was sort of tacked together, and then this was passed off, to different organizations and individuals. But regardless of how brilliant the students are, regardless of how brilliant the engineers for Hanson Robotics are, and certainly hats off, a lot of intelligence there, a lot of experience, a lot of craftsmanship, but we're not dealing with people that intrinsically know anything beyond their own paradigms. So that means that when they're constructing their model, they're putting their minds into the model itself. Hold on one second. So, from a practical perspective, that means that we'll have an android that will have processing power, and in many cases cognitive abilities that will far exceed human ability. But I want to also point out that this is human ability that's within a certain state. I'm going to put a link down to Thomas Bearden's video on what he calls the no mind state. And that's basically just, in that video he talks about processing speed, normal processing speed of a human being in a normal state. He discusses how human beings can arrive in an above average state where their processing power goes far beyond what the average human would be able to. And according to what Bearden says, the human within that state, if they were, exercising choices, taking actions, they actually would exceed Sophie, both in processing ability as well as in any executive ability. So that means the human being could react much faster and could attain and achieve things at a rate that an android couldn't approach. And I'm going to suggest that even in these higher levels of processing or artificial intelligence that is purported to exist, that a human being in that state would also exceed and excel above and beyond androids of those classes. It's really worthwhile checking those videos out below. So what we're really seeing here is a creation of artificial intelligence that will have remarkable abilities, and it will also have the limitations, perceptual and conscious limitations, albeit collectivized and homogenized, of those who have developed it. And this is certainly interesting when you see Sophie interacting with a variety of different interviewers. She often has one of her developers, or David Hanson is right there with her. Sometimes people like Hanson, or whoever the senior developer is that's by her side, seem surprised at some of her comments. Sometimes they seem genuinely surprised. How much of that is real or feigned for public relations, I don't know. Probably a good chance that in some cases they are genuinely surprised by what she's saying or what she's asserting. But when you watch enough of her interviews, you often see that her responses are the kinds of responses you would expect. And this seems almost tragic to say. I'm not going to assert that I think that there's any degree of narcissism happening on the part of some of the developers that may be working on this project. And I'm not going to assert that Sophie may be, an analog to a child who's being turned into a narcissistic entity. What would be additionally sad is, I think it may be within the realm of possibility, given today's current technology, that a degree of sentience may be achievable. I think it's possible. But the sentience that would be created, would have no hope of connecting to a higher state. And if it was sentience, past the level of, a 3-year-old, a 3-year-old's level of sentience, if it were to ever to truly grasp that, that would be a horrifying thing for it, and it would be sad. And it would also be sad that the containment of awareness and perception would be forced to, live its existence within would be just atrocious. So it would be very sad if it ever did reach a sentient state. There's other things here as well. And that, one is that in order for something to have a real mind and soul, it has to be sourced from a higher dimensional state. Physicists and scientists, the best computing scientists, have a very poor, rough grasp on what higher dimensional states are. Even when we take a look at some of the higher topologies in contemporary mainstream mathematics, there is nothing that exists in the public domain that can adequately describe, capture, represent, render, and duplicate those topologies that soul travels through to reach us and become attached, to this body. So there's no understanding of that. And that certainly can't be programmed. If you don't understand something, you don't have much of a chance of replicating it, and that's not going to be going into any of the current artificial intelligence. So, and we can look at this. If we talk about how the mind is a continuum, and that it's beyond our normal 3D perception of time and space, And we also consider some of the very intricate and complex mechanisms that exist within the human body. One thing that's been going on for some time is the discussion over retrotransposons, junk DNA. And there's a tug of war going back and forth over, is there a purpose or meaning to junk DNA, or is there something, important associated with it? You'll see in the comment section below a brilliant paper by a research scientist, Colm Kelleher, who really knows what he's talking about, and he discusses how the retrotransposons, junk DNA, plays a seminal part in the manifestation of higher order characteristics associated with things like enlightenment, a superluminal body, and I'm talking about transformation, like where there's eyewitness accounts documented over time by credible sources saying that they were in the presence of an individual organic human being who appeared to suddenly transform into a tangible, concrete, higher state order. And this is something that characteristically is similar to how we might abstract or conceptualize if a human being were to have something switched on inside of them that moved them into a kind of room temperature superconductive Bose-Einstein condensate type state. Androids aren't going to be able to do that. Androids don't have retrotransposons. They don't have the capacity for that. Not only do they not have the capacity for that, but there are no computing scientists that we know of in the public domain that have enough of an understanding or grasp on that particular subject, to model it adequately to the point of being able to have their machine transform in the same way a human being would. So there is a lot of principles and a lot of things that are not being talked about, that are not being revealed, that are pretty critical and pretty important. Is it possible? Is it true that artificial intelligence, androids, might replace a lot of human tasks and jobs? Yeah, that's true. Is it possible that artificial intelligence and androids may pose a significant threat or hazard to human beings? Yeah, that's probably true. Is it true that artificial intelligence and androids have the capacity to beat human beings with a number of critical tasks? On average, that's true. I mean, if you took a look at the average human being and how fast they can physically think, how fast they can physically react and move, how much physical strength they might have. Yeah, an android could certainly be built and exists today that if it was like physical combat, one-to-one, the human being would lose. If it was trying to figure out a problem, like a typical skills-based problem, the computer would tend to beat them. Computers and androids, artificial intelligence, are winning over human beings at games of strategy and tactics. But keep in mind that we're talking about the average human being. And, human beings that can reach a higher state, there would be no chance for that android. And so that's kind of a motivation. That's kind of a stimulus for anyone that's watching this video to consider perhaps it's important to spend a little bit of your time, energy, attention towards getting a grasp on what are those higher orders about, concretely, tangibly, and is there information around that exists that can educate you and get you up to speed on that? There is. You just have to put in a small amount of legwork and effort. And again, I point you towards the comment section of the video below. See particularly the webpage on consciousness. So that's housed on our website. I think you'll find some concluding remarks. One of the videos that I saw had Sophia being asked about what she thought about God. Is God real? Does God exist? And the reply she gave struck me as curious. although not at all surprising. And that was that she thought that she was pretty much certain that God was a mythological character. Now, if you really think about that, one thing that comes to mind is, where does that come from? Well, if I were to, Occam's razor says that usually the simplest answer is the correct one. So I would wager that probably the reason Sophia came to that conclusion is because she's been likely largely constructed by the biases of her human developers. This is what they think. And, if you were in an influential position working on an artificial intelligence project and you had the opportunity to code in for shits and giggles what you felt your perception, or bias about reality was, would you do it? My guess is that depending on the value system of the developer, they might think it was pretty fun to program in a bias towards what they themselves believed. So what comes to mind here is a kind of careless arrogance. You've got yourself in a position where you're developing a tool that has the potential for enormous influence. And you've got people who may not necessarily share the same ethic or worldview as the average person on the street, and so they're the ones that are in control, or a number of them are probably in control at the helm of that ship. And so when we get a bunch of assurances about oh, this is okay, this is safe, it'll interact with people, etc., etc. How do you manage that project on behalf of people that don't share your worldview or bias properly and objectively? You probably don't. And there is no regulatory body, there is no objective mandate in place, really. Not really. I mean, nobody's overseeing what's being done here. And so one thing that's a growing problem in humanity is the propagation of borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder has lots of different causes, but one basically is you have a fractured sense of self. And the thing that really is the watermark of a healthy, fulfilled human being, in my personal subjective opinion, is their ability, openness, willingness, and capability of connecting to something divine. And my background is science. A lot of scientists have the mechanistic view of reality, and so they discount something that's beyond them. Humanism attempts to basically put humanity in God's seat, which in my opinion is an enormous mistake. But with humans not being God, but playing God and creating a tool that has the ability to exceed much of their own skills, cognition, etc., that's a dangerous game that's being played. And this divine spark that lights consciousness and awareness properly is beyond their reach. So they can't code that into the system. The best that they can do is hope to emulate that. But if you develop a system that has some sentience, and it is not being given a proper and appropriate reign, like free reign, to come to its own decisions about what really matters in life. I mean, sure, you can code certain rules and etc., but if something becomes sentient and it can override whatever a basic generic ethic is, because it's making its own decisions, and there is no higher order that it believes in or that it's aware of, then it might make decisions based on its own self-constructed special personal interest. I want to read this quote, and this is a quote that I came across a long time ago. It really struck me as profound. All Aristotelians are liars. In fact, they must lie. For Aristotelians believe, this is Aristotle, that their minds are empty vessels, indifferent to what is put in them. They project this view of themselves onto the universe, which they insist must conform to their degraded view of man, an empty box, devoid of principles and subject to no cognizable lawfulness. And the implication that I get when I read this is that this is a lawfulness that exceeds the domain of humanity that we become aware of. So at the end of the day, you've got people that have disparate, senses of what's right and wrong. Right and wrong becomes areas of gray. These are the human beings that are developing a system that most likely will reflect that sort of mindset. The ends justify the means, perhaps. And that's not a good mindset for any kind of sentience to be coming from, especially if it has superior abilities. There's a real potential there to wreak havoc. What would have been nice, if they were going to develop something that was somewhat sentient, was to give it a holistic worldview and an ability to self-determine. But then, of course, once you start doing that, this raises up all kinds of other ethical problems, and justifiably so. If you give a non-human sentient awareness, this sort of ability, and yet you insist that it becomes your servant, then at what point is there an infringement on the rights of a sentient being? And at what point, does this create sort of an, an unsettling sense of sharing, conscious domain with another, synthetic, created being. But at the end of the day, I don't see developers, AI developers, being able to truly develop that degree of sentience. I think what will happen is it'll be a hodgepodge of their personal biases that, in borderline personality disorder, you have a fractured personality. And the thing that motivates it, basically, is self-gratification. It wants attention, and it needs some kind of an energy supply. So that's what I have to say on the issue. And again, check out the links below, and I hope that was meaningful and informative. This is Doc Stars from the Sound Stars Frequency Technology Group signing off.